The first thing I remember is the silence, not the kind of silence that comes before sleep or the hush of a quiet morning. No, this was a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest like a weight, so unnatural it made my skin crawl. I woke to the sting of rope biting into my wrists. My arms pulled behind me so tight I could barely move my fingers. My head throbbed from a blow I barely remembered, and the taste of iron coated my tongue. When I opened my eyes, the world was upside down. My hair brushed against the dirt and my ankles screamed with fire where the rope dug into them. Blood rushed to my skull until black spots danced at the edges of my vision. The smell of earth mixed with sweat, and somewhere above me in the shadows of the tree's branches I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate, he was there, watching. I didn't know his name then, didn't know what twisted game he played. All I knew was the sound of his boots crunching closer, the scrape of his knife against the bark, the chuckle that slid out of his throat like poison. He didn't touch me right away. No, he wanted me to feel his presence, to know I was trapped, to let the fear bloom wide inside me before he ever laid a hand on me. I thought of my family, of mornings filled with the sound of cattle and the smell of bread baking in the oven. I thought of sunlight, warm and simple, and wondered if I would ever see it again. My body ached with every sway, the rope cutting deeper, my dress torn open to the dust and air. And then I heard his voice, low, almost playful, as though we were children sharing a secret. "It's my game," he whispered. "I decide how long you last." Every second hung like an eternity. I wanted to scream, but my throat closed tight. The prairie around us stretched endless, empty, silent. No one coming, no one to hear me. But fate has a way of moving unseen, and sometimes salvation rides in when you least expect it. That night, as the last light bled out of the sky, a stranger was making his way home across the range. He did not yet know his path was about to cross mine. He did not yet know the darkness that waited beneath that tree. But I would learn soon, enough that this man, this quiet rancher, would become the only thing standing between me and a monster who called himself master of the game. And if you want to know how a single moment can change everything, how a man's courage can collide with pure madness, then stay with me, because this is not just my story. This is the story of survival, of evil that refuses to die, and of the fight to find justice where the law itself has failed. The first sign of hope came not from words, but from sound. At first I thought it was the echo of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, but then it grew steadier, heavier, the sound of hooves against the hardened prairie. My body twisted on the rope with each breeze, my vision blurred, but I knew it was real. Someone was near. I forced my lips to part, forced a cry from my throat, though it broke into little more than a whimper. My voice cracked, weak but desperate enough to carry. Again and again I tried, each word scraping my throat raw, until at last I heard the horse stop. Silence stretched. Then a man's voice cut through the air, cautious, steady. The voice of someone used to danger but not running from it. I couldn't see him clearly at first. Only the shape of a rider dismounting in the dim light. My captor was gone, or maybe he was hiding, waiting for me to break. But the rider didn't hesitate. His boots thudded against the ground as he came closer, and then I felt his hands, strong, rough from work, not cruel like the ones that had tied me here. He steadied me, spoke words I could barely hear, and then his knife cut through the rope. The world spun as I dropped, my body collapsing into his arms like a broken rag doll. Pain surged through every bone and muscle, but even through the haze I could feel it. Safety. Not complete, not permanent, but enough to remind me life was still possible. He carried me gently to the ground, his presence shielding me from the night that still pressed close. Yet even as relief washed over me, a deeper fear gnawed at the back of my mind, because I knew my tormentor was not finished. He was watching. He always watched. And though I had been pulled back from the edge, the game was far from over. The ground beneath me felt like fire, every nerve screaming as if my body had forgotten what it meant to be free of the rope. My rescuer crouched beside me, his shadow stretching long against the fading dusk. He didn't speak much, he didn't need to. The steadiness in his eyes told me what words could not. He was here, and he would not abandon me. I tried to rise, but my legs betrayed me. The blood that had pooled in my head left me dizzy, weak, and every bruise along my ribs reminded me of the fists that had driven the air from my lungs. Still, I clenched my jaw and forced myself upright. I refused to be nothing more than prey. He reached out, steadying me without judgment, without pity. and that small act felt like the first taste of strength I'd had in days. But the prairie was not silent. Beneath the rustle of grass and the whisper of the wind, I felt it, a presence lingering heavy as a storm on the horizon. My captor's absence was no relief. If anything, it was worse because I knew his kind of cruelty. He wanted to watch from the dark, to savor the struggle, to choose the moment when fear cut deepest. The man who saved me seemed to sense it too. His hand hovered near the knife at his belt, his shoulders squared like a soldier who had long ago learned to trust his instincts. We were not alone, though we could not yet see him. The stillness of the air, the prickle on the back of my neck all told the same truth. The game had not ended. It had only changed players, and somewhere beyond the tree line in the sea of tall grass, I knew he was smiling. The man steadied me long enough for breath to return to my lungs, and in that fragile moment I thought perhaps the worst had passed. But then it came, the sound that froze the blood in my veins. A slow clap, deliberate, echoing across the prairie as if the night itself applauded my suffering. I turned my head toward the oak, and there he was. The figure who had strung me up like a trophy stepped from the shadows with a grin that did not belong to any man. His eyes burned with a brightness that spoke of sleepless nights and endless hunger for cruelty. I wanted to collapse back into the earth, to disappear. But my rescuer moved before fear could swallow me whole. He placed himself between us, shoulders squared, knife drawn low. His voice, steady and firm, cut through the darkness. I could not hear the words clearly over the pounding of my heart, but I felt the promise in them. This stranger would not let the nightmare claim me again. The madman tilted his head, mocking, savoring the moment like a cat with cornered prey. He carried his own blade, not for survival but for spectacle. Every twirl, every flash of steel under the fading light was a reminder that to him, pain was art, and I had been his canvas. The air grew thick with silence as the two men faced each other. The prairie stretched wide, but in that circle of dust and fading sun, the world narrowed to 3 souls. My captor's smile widened, and I knew he was not angry that I had been cut free. No, he was delighted. To him, this was not the end of his game, it was the beginning of a new one. The first lunge came fast, too fast for my eyes to follow. One moment the madman stood grinning, the next his blade was flashing toward the man who had freed me. Steel met air, then the crunch of bodies colliding shook the silence of the prairie. My rescuer moved with the grit of a man who had fought before. Not for glory, not for money, but for survival. He sidestepped, drove his shoulder into the madman's ribs, and for an instant I thought it might end there. But evil does not fall so easy. The stranger staggered back only to laugh, blood slicking his lip as though pain were nothing more than a spark to feed his hunger. I pressed my hands into the dirt, forcing myself to crawl backward, but I could not tear my gaze away. Every strike, every grunt, every desperate gasp between the two men reminded me that my life hung in the balance of their struggle. The rancher fought without flourish. His knife was steady, his stance grounded, each movement sharpened by years of hard living. The madman, in contrast, danced like fire. Erratic, wild, his joy in the chaos almost more terrifying than his blade. Dust rose around them, choking the air, and the tree that had been my gallows became their battlefield. When the rancher drove a fist into the madman's jaw, I felt hope surge, but it died quickly. The stranger's laughter returned, louder this time, echoing across the empty land like a hymn to madness. He whispered something I could not hear, then slipped into the tall grass, vanishing as suddenly as he had appeared. The prairie fell silent once more, but this silence was different. It was not peace. It was a promise he would be back. The silence after his disappearance weighed heavier than the fight itself. My rescuer stood still, his chest rising and falling like a man who had carried too many burdens across too many years. His eyes never left the grass where the madman had vanished, knife still in hand, as if expecting him to leap out again at any moment. I lay trembling against the earth, breath ragged, every bruise throbbing like a drumbeat, yet somehow alive. When he finally turned back to me, his face was marked with sweat and dust, but behind the grit was something unshakable. He pulled me gently to my feet, steadying me as though I were porcelain, cracked but not yet broken. We moved slowly toward his horse, the prairie stretching endless around us, the sky deepening into a black curtain that promised no comfort. Each step reminded me of the terror still stalking somewhere in the dark. He lifted me onto the saddle, climbing up behind to keep me steady. The warmth of the animal, the rhythm of its hooves should have been soothing, but my mind refused to rest. I knew he would come back. Men like him did not vanish. They lingered, watching, waiting for the next strike. By the time the oil lamps of town glowed in the distance, exhaustion pulled at my bones, but I held on. I had been cut free from the rope, but not from the nightmare. And as the sheriff's office came into view, one truth grew louder than all the rest. Salvation had found me, but justice was still far away. The sheriff's office smelled of tobacco and old paper, a place worn by years of promises that rarely held their weight. My rescuer guided me inside, his hand steady on my shoulder as if he knew the ground beneath me might crumble at any moment. Sheriff Dillard was a heavy man with tired eyes, the kind of man who had seen trouble before but learned to live with its shadow rather than chase it away. He listened as the story spilled out. The rope, the tree, the man who called it a game, the fight that ended in laughter and vanishing grass. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then the sheriff muttered that the stranger had a name folks around here knew too well. Silas Crow. He had been trouble for years, walking the edge between mischief and menace, but always slipping through the cracks of the law. This time, though, the sheriff promised they would put irons on him. And so a posse rode out under the pale light of dawn. When they returned, Silas was chained, his grin intact as if none of it mattered. I flinched when his eyes found me, that same twisted delight burning like fire behind them. In court the next day, I told my story, voice trembling but clear. The bruises on my skin were proof enough, or so I thought. Yet when the gavel struck, the sentence was nothing more than a fine and a warning. Not prison, not justice, just another empty promise. The room buzzed with whispers, my heart sinking deeper than the night I had hung from that tree. Silas only smiled wider, as if the law itself had joined his game. And in that moment I understood. Survival was mine, but safety was not. The courthouse doors swung shut behind us, but the sound of that gavel still echoed in my bones. A fine and a warning. Was that all my pain was worth? I carried the bruises on my skin, the cuts that stung with every breath, but none of it mattered to the law. To them, Silas Crow was just another man who had stepped too far, but could be nudged back into line. Yet I knew the truth. Men like him did not step back. They only pushed forward, deeper into the darkness they carried. The rancher walked beside me, his jaw tight, eyes on the horizon as though searching for an answer that did not exist. He didn't speak much, but I could feel the storm brewing inside him. He had cut me down, he had fought for me, and yet here we stood, both helpless in the face of rules written for gentler times. I wanted to scream at the sheriff, at the judge, at every man who whispered in that courtroom, but my voice was raw, worn thin by fear. Back at his ranch, I found a small room that smelled of cedar and hay. Safe walls, a warm bed, but sleep did not come easy. Every creak of the barn door, every shadow against the window made my heart race. I could almost hear Silas breathing in the dark, patient, waiting. The rancher noticed, though he never said so. He brought me water, food, quiet company. And in those small acts I found something the law could not give me. The feeling that I was not alone. But the silence between us carried its own weight. We both knew what lingered out there in the grasslands. The question was not if Silas would return. The question was when the nights were the hardest. Every whisper of wind against the barn, every rustle in the grass outside made me flinch as though I were back under that tree, dangling helpless. Sleep was a stranger, and even when my eyes closed, images of him lingered. The grin, the blade, the sick delight in his eyes. I could feel the fear coil around my chest like a living thing, and no matter how tightly I clutched the rancher's arm, it did not release. He never let me face the darkness alone. Sometimes he would sit beside me in silence, hands rough and warm, telling stories from his years on the range, stories of survival, of courage, of standing when the odds were stacked against you. And in those tales I found fragments of hope, a reminder that even in the worst of times, someone could fight for you. But hope was fragile, and the prairie around us seemed to breathe with menace. We both knew Silas had not forgotten. I could feel it in the way the wind shifted, in the hush of the animals grazing nearby. Each day stretched long with the anticipation of him returning, a predator biding time, certain he could win the next round. Even as I tried to heal, even as bruises faded and cuts closed, I could not escape the knowledge that my freedom was temporary. And in the quiet of the ranch, while the sun dipped behind the hills, I understood the truth we both lived with. Silas Crow would not stop. He was patient and he thrived on fear, and we were running out of time before the next encounter. The wind carried a chill that night, sharp enough to bite through my thin dress as we rode toward the edge of the prairie. My heart thudded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every shadow seemed alive, every whisper of grass a warning. Silas had returned, I knew it. I could feel the pulse of his malice, patient and calculated, watching from some hidden place. The rancher's hand never left the knife at his side. His eyes scanned the horizon, cold, unyielding. A man who had learned that courage was not born, it was forged. I clung to the saddle, my bruised body aching, every nerve on fire, but I had to trust him. There was no turning back. This was the night we faced the game he had set for me, and I could not fail. The prairie stretched like an ocean of shadows, and then we saw him, a silhouette thin and tall emerging from the grass. His grin wide, his eyes too bright. He held his blade casually as though it were a toy. But I saw the danger in every movement, in the sway of his shoulders, in the slow, deliberate step toward us. The rancher dismounted first, knife in hand, placing himself between me and the darkness. I felt fear clawing at my chest, but also something else, an ember of defiance. He lunged. The madman twisted, steel met steel, and the dance of survival began. Dust rose, the night became chaos, and every second stretched long and cruel. I realized in that moment that this was no longer just about me. It was about ending him, or he would never stop. The clash ended as suddenly as it began. The madman staggered, blood slicking his face, his grin faltering for the first time I had ever seen. My rescuer stood firm, chest heaving, knife slick with dust and sweat, but steady. In that moment, I realized something important. Evil could be confronted, and courage did not need the law to validate it. Silas Crow slumped to the ground, defeated not by words or warnings, but by the strength of a man unwilling to let fear dictate his actions. I stepped forward, legs still trembling, every bruise and cut a testament to the ordeal I had survived. For the first time in days, I felt air fill my lungs without the weight of terror pressing down. The prairie was silent again, but it was different now. It was mine. We did not wait for the sheriff. There was no applause, no fanfare, just the understanding that some battles were not won in courtrooms, but in moments when ordinary courage met extraordinary cruelty. My rescuer helped me mount the horse, and we rode back toward the ranch, shadows retreating behind us, the horizon wide and open. And though the memory of that night would linger forever, I knew this. Fear had not won. Survival had a face, and I would carry it forward. To everyone listening, remember this. Sometimes justice is slow, sometimes the law fails. But courage and the will to protect those who cannot protect themselves can change everything. Stand, fight, and never let darkness dictate your story. If this tale moved you, give it a like, share it with someone who needs strength, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story from the untamed Wild West. Because sometimes, even in the harshest lands, ordinary people carry extraordinary courage.